Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Big news yesterday from the Mamdani administration, maybe the biggest yet since he became mayor. You know that when he ran for mayor, his housing message mostly came down to a single phrase, freeze the rent. But the housing plan his administration put out yesterday goes well beyond that. The plan, called Block by Block, sets a 10-year goal of 200,000 new affordable homes and 200,000 more preserved, with more than $22 billion behind it over the next 5 years. It reaches into just about every corner of housing, from NYCHA to bad landlords, to a new path for renters to become owners, even ways to protect stressed landlords from rent stabilization freezes if they come about. WNYC and Gothamist housing reporter David Brand has been poring over it, and he's here to give us some of the highlights and take your questions. Hey, David, always good to have you on the show.
Hey, Brian, thanks for having me.
So let's start with NYCHA, since it's a huge piece of this. We already know the vast majority of these buildings are in rough shape. Mayor after mayor promises to address it, but what's the plan under Mamdani that's any different, if it is, to make NYCHA more livable?
Well, Mamdani is going to continue a lot of what was put in place under previous administrations, starting with Mayor Bill de Blasio, continued under Mayor Eric Adams, to turn a lot of NYCHA campuses over to private managers through what's called the RAD Pact program. I think can be somewhat surprising to some people because it's not something he talked about that much on the campaign trail, and this concept of privatizing management for public housing has been somewhat controversial, especially on the left where Mamdani comes from. But his housing plan really embraces private management as a key tool to raising money for public housing, and something that he's going to step up, though he does say he wants to increase oversight and have more mechanisms, I think, for replacing, quote, bad managers.
Tell me more about the private investment part, because I know that's one of the things that's making news here. It's the kind of, I'll just say the kind of idea and proposal from past mayors that he ran against. We don't want to privatize public housing, put profit motive into it. It's going to be bad for the tenants. But now he is embracing some of that. So why the change in more detail, and what would the change look like in more detail?
Well, I think it's kind of a realistic approach that additional federal money is not coming to NYCHA, and so in order to raise additional money, you need to change the source of federal funding for each NYCHA unit from what is traditionally Section 9 public housing to Section 8 federal voucher program attached to each one of these units. It comes with more money, and NYCHA says it also allows them to borrow more money to invest in the properties and make repairs. So that's one component of it. Another is that private managers are incentivized to make repairs, to make renovations to the campuses. And in one case that we're seeing in Chelsea right now, to try to do an entire redevelopment plan that has been somewhat controversial, I'd say somewhat controversial to some, very controversial to a lot of people living in that section of Chelsea, but also supported by a lot of people. And that is a plan to build new public housing along with mixed income, so low-income housing, and also what might be considered luxury or high-rent housing on the campus of the Chelsea Elliott houses and Fulton houses, two campuses in Chelsea. And that's something that Mamdani wants to do more of.
Let's go on to this 200,000 new homes, 200,000 preserved homes that are affordable. And let's talk about the preserved first, because I think this confuses people when it comes up. Like, is this really expanding affordable housing? De Blasio had this, Adams had this. They all say new or preserved affordable units. Mamdani is saying 200,000 of each. What's the preservation part, and does it really count? Should it count toward what a mayor is doing to expand affordable housing, which we all agree is in short supply?
Yeah, I totally hear that, and has been a question I've had for a while. But I think I saw Barika Williams, who runs the Organization Association for Neighborhood Housing Development, and she was on TV describing this the other day about why preservation is so important. And she said that you can add all these new units, but if you're losing currently affordable units, then you're just basically getting to baseline. So you want to invest in the existing affordable housing, make sure it stays affordable and habitable while also building new units. And I thought that was a good way to think of it. So the preservation...
And landlords are always trying to use the various housing laws to take units out of rent stabilization, right?
Correct. I mean, that's a lot harder to do now, but yeah, for decades we saw that, and that's why we have a lot fewer rent-stabilized units, tens of thousands fewer rent-stabilized units now than we did 30 years ago. This also would apply to buildings that receive tax breaks or have other regulatory agreements with the government where the affordability requirements expire after a certain time period. So you think of the 421A tax break, that expires after 25 years or after 30 years. And after that, once an apartment becomes vacant, the landlord could bring it up to market rent. So a preservation deal by the city could be to provide additional tax breaks or additional funding. In an exchange for that, the owner would keep it rent stabilized and affordable. So there's a mix of types of preservation.
And what about new affordable? Because this has been one of the critiques of the mayor. He ran on freeze the rent, but even if he accomplishes that through the campaign, through the Rent Guidelines Board, that only applies to people who already have rent stabilized apartments, and there's such a great need for additional, in whatever category we call it, rent stabilized or something else that is affordable or below market rate housing. So what are the building blocks in this new Mamdani housing plan for additional affordable housing, not just freeze the rent for people who are already in rent stabilized apartments?
Yeah, it was interesting to hear Mamdani talking about this and kind of his introduction to his plan yesterday, where he wanted to speak directly to what he called skeptical New Yorkers, people who are dubious of development and worried that it would only lead to the kind of quote-unquote luxury housing that favors the rich. And he said, I want to speak to skeptical New Yorkers because I myself was a skeptical New Yorker. He was skeptical of new development and opposed development projects. But this plan really embraces a lot of new development everywhere in the city. It specifically focuses on, like you said, adding 200,000 new affordable housing units to the city over the next decade. We use that term a lot, affordable. There's actually a specific meaning. It means that the renter pays no more than 30% of their income toward rent. And that when we talk about affordable housing, that means housing that receives government funding or subsidy, financing, or tax breaks. And in exchange, keeps the rents capped for low and middle income tenants. So he said they're going to build 200,000 units over the next decade. That was actually his campaign pledge as well. It's a lot of housing. That would obviously mean 20,000 new affordable units a year. Last fiscal year, the city did about 12,400. That's through a mix of housing that's financed by the city housing agency. So there's billions of dollars that the city's Department of Housing Preservation Development has to fund, to make loans on these affordable housing projects. But it's also affordable housing that results from rezonings. So if a building goes up in an area that has been rezoned for larger residential development, a portion of those new units have to be rent stabilized and affordable, and that also counts toward that number.
Do you have any historical numbers on this? Mamdani pledged, de Blasio pledged in the hundreds of thousands, Bloomberg pledged in the hundreds of thousands of new or preserved, as they called it, affordable units. Do you have off the top of your head how many new were created under any of the recent administrations? I realize I'm putting you on the spot with that.
No, I was actually looking at this yesterday for that historical context. So the de Blasio administration, de Blasio, he had multiple housing plans, and he touted this goal of 200,000 new and preserved units. At the end of his term, he said that they managed to create 202,000, to create and preserve 202,000. So he surpassed that goal. Bloomberg similarly combined.
You don't know how many of those were new?
No, I could look that up because there was a lot of rundowns on the de Blasio kind of look back.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, I'm curious too. Now that you asked, I should have come prepared with those numbers. But then, similarly with Bloomberg, he said that they did 175 new and preserved units. But maybe in a few moments, I could just take a look at that. Real quick.
And that's over 3 terms.
Correct,
so if Mamdani gets to 200,000 new and 200,000 preserved in 5 years, as this plan lays out, it would be quite an accomplishment compared to Bloomberg over 12 years, who certainly talked about this as an issue.
Well, Bloomberg, I think he's synonymous with a lot of the rezonings along waterfronts in Williamsburg, Greenpoint, Long Island City, downtown Brooklyn that led to huge new development. But he actually downzoned, reduced residential capacity in about 40% of the city. So that would cap those numbers of new units elsewhere.
Okay. And of course, these are just projected numbers in a plan. In 5 years, we'll be talking about, in 5 years, if he gets elected or, reelected, certainly in the reelection campaign that we presume will come in 2029, everybody will be looking at those numbers as to what's actually been done. We're going over details in the major new housing policy proposals released by the Mamdani administration yesterday with our WNYC and Gothamist housing reporter, David Brand. And if you have any questions, 212-433, WNYC 212-433-9692, call or text. Let's go next to how the plan goes hard at the city's worst landlords with a new program called Fix the City. What can the city do to a bad landlord now that this is being implemented that it couldn't do before?
Well, they want to, I think, have more focus on the quote-unquote worst landlords and like the landlords that are on the annual list that's put out by the public advocate, and really be relentless about inspections and violations and collecting on fines. And if the landlord is incapable of making the repairs, paying the fines, in some cases paying their property taxes too, that the city's going to be, I think, a lot more aggressive in trying to take those buildings away and transfer them to another private entity or nonprofit group who they deem more responsible.
Do you know how you do that? Under the law, this forcing some of them to sell, how can the government force an owner of a building to sell private property? Do you know the mechanism for that and whether that would be new under Mamdani?
Well, at this point, there isn't really a clear mechanism to do that. I mean, they could be so aggressive and negotiate with the owner and be like, look, you got to sell this property. You got to let us find a new buyer who we will then give funds and financing to make repairs and, we talked about preserve these affordable units. But there isn't like a clear mechanism right now. There is a bill that has been kicked around for the last several years. It's sponsored by Councilmember Parina Sanchez. She's chair of the Housing Committee, that would resurrect the city's third-party transfer program. And so if a property owner owes a certain amount of unpaid taxes, fines, water bills, and they also have a certain number of housing code violations per apartment, that would make them eligible for this proposed program. And that would allow the city to essentially foreclose, but instead of becoming the owner, to transfer it to another entity to redevelop. So
that's how they would address the critics, especially on the right, who are calling this the city seizing private property.
Yeah, the third-party transfer program was around for several years. I think it was even started under Mayor Giuliani to try to get the city out of the property ownership business and instead foreclose and then transfer buildings. It was stopped in 2019 over concerns about that it was targeting lower-income homeowners, mostly in communities of color, black neighborhoods, Southeast Queens, and over kind of small issues instead of very egregious problems by very big landlords who owed a lot of money and had a lot of housing code violations. So they're trying to tailor it to hit more of those types of properties.
Let's take a call from Marcia in Brooklyn, who says she's a tenants advocate. Marcia, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hey, good morning. Thanks. And thank you for the conversation. I'm curious about the quality of the buildings that are going up and also about the high rises that contain affordable units. But
whoops, her line dropped out. She was going to ask about high rises that are going up that don't contain many affordable units. I have a similar text. She's in Brooklyn. This text says, I live in the Inwood neighborhood of Manhattan. There are several large apartment buildings that have recently been completed and others now starting, but they don't seem to have any affordable units. Because their online ads that I've seen list studio apartments for $3,400 per month. How can the mayor make sure permanently affordable units are built?
All right. Well, two questions there. One that I've been paying a lot of attention to recently. I've done a few stories that we've called crappy luxury about a lot of brand new buildings, many of them branded as luxury that actually have a ton of problems and unexpected problems, broken elevators, flooding, heat and hot water outages. And so it's a pretty significant subset of new buildings and high rent buildings that are having those types of problems, whether that's shoddy construction, corner cutting, or just unexpected problems that it took, hundreds of people living in the building at the same time, all using the water to really expose and get fixed. So that's definitely a problem. The issue of these high rises with no affordable housing or with not enough affordable housing, we do see a lot of these super talls and a lot of these very skinny buildings that get built in their condo buildings. And yeah, there's no affordable housing. And in fact, there's not much housing at all because a lot of these units are duplexes or triplexes that they are some of the tallest buildings in the city but have no affordable housing. Not necessarily what she's talking about. If she's talking about buildings in Inwood that came up as a result of the rezoning in Inwood, those buildings should have affordable housing based on the city's rules called mandatory inclusionary housing. After a rezoning, any building that's built has to have about a quarter of the new apartments with their incomes capped for low and middle income renters.
So it could be that the listener just isn't seeing those advertised. They're advertising the market rate ones.
Right. Those would have to go through the housing lottery, the city's Housing Connect lottery. But there's always that constant issue that new affordable units aren't actually that affordable. And some are intended for upper middle income people. And when we think of affordable, we think of a low income renter who's desperate for a new apartment and not, a lot of these buildings don't have those.
Let me correct something that I said before. I said that this was a 5-year plan, which I had read, to create 200,000 new affordable housing units. But I think it's actually a 10-year plan. Is that correct?
Oh, correct. Yes. 10 years. So about 20,000 new, 20,000 preserved affordable units every year for this plan.
Another thing that I saw break out in some of the reporting is that for all he focuses on the need to freeze the rent, there is something in here to exempt some struggling landlords from the rent freeze should it pass the Rent Guidelines Board. Am I seeing that correctly?
Yeah, this was kind of a stunning headline from the Wall Street Journal yesterday. And at Mamdani's press conference, the first two questions came from my colleague at City Limits named Patrick Spouster, and then me asking, where is this coming from? Just because nothing in the plan actually says this. And so I think that came from a conversation with the HPD commissioner and the reporter at the Wall Street Journal. And it is striking. They said the headline is inaccurate, but this is a possibility. And so this is complicated, but I can break this down. Some apartment buildings that have city financing or are subject to some type of government funding or property tax break could increase the rents on vacant units that with rents currently capped for low-income renters under certain circumstances. So, I was talking to people working for the city and some affordable housing advocates yesterday who said this is occasionally done already. There are tools to accomplish this, but it's rare. And so you think about a building that was built in 2016, and an apartment in that building was reserved for a family of 3 earning 60% of the area median income, which is how they determine the affordability levels in these new affordable apartments. Well, back in 2016, the 60% of the area median income for a family of 3 was about $47,000. And I did the math on this. That would be, to be affordable for that family, they would have to set the rent at about $1,200 a month. 10 years later, with rent increases from the Rent Guidelines Board, maybe we'd say that rent would be $1,500 a month or $1,600 a month. Well, now in 2026, the AMI, the area median income for a family of 3, at 60% area median income, is about $92,000. And so that rent could now be set at about $2,300 a month and still be considered affordable, as in 30% of their income. So what the city could do in some cases is allow the owner of that building to then set that rent at $2,300 a month instead of what it currently is, maybe $1,600 a month. But people working for the city said that's going to be rare. It is interesting, and it is also prompted private landlords to say, like, well, what about us? We're dealing with similar problems and we're in financial distress. Why can't we do that? So I think that is going to start a new conversation about rent regulations and how the city intervenes. And
we took a tenants advocate's call before. Let's take one landlord call before we run out of time. Jean in Fresh Meadows, you're on WNYC with our housing reporter, David Brand. Hi, Jean.
Hi, I am a landlord with a building with 30 units, and the building operates in the red. I don't even know what to do. I can't even sell it for pennies on the dollar. I don't know what to do because the economics don't work. If you're going to cut my money in, how is my money going to come out?
Is it rent stabilized?
Yes, it's rent stabilized. I would live there myself. I would take my small children and live there myself. I am proud of my building. I take care of my tenants.
David, have you heard things like this before? It sounds like she wants to sell the building because it's under such financial stress, but you can't even find a buyer, if that story is real.
Yeah, well, hear that a lot from owners who either, their margins are a lot thinner than they were, or, like she said, operating the red. There is a subset of rent-stabilized buildings, 9 or 10% in the city, that are their operating expenses outpace incomes from rent and other sources. There are programs that the state's housing agency offers to, if you can prove that you are operating at a deficit, that you could apply for a rent increase in your buildings. Very few people actually apply for that. Very few landlords. It's, I think, an onerous process and takes a long time. But it's hear this a lot from owners that either their operating expenses have risen so much and they can't keep up with Rent Guidelines Board increases on rent-stabilized apartments. This housing plan addresses that somewhat, talking about the need for property tax reform and how readjusting property taxes will actually decrease property taxes by, like 1.7%, I think it is, for owners of rent-stabilized housing. Owner trade groups say, well, that's fine, you can reduce it by 1.7%, but over the past decade, it's gone up X number. And then,
right.
They're trying to curb rising insurance costs. That's going to be a long process. So trying to lower some of these operating expenses so that there's less pressure to raise rents. But for a lot of cases, you hear this from a lot of property owners that they want more revenue.
We're over time, but I want to get this last wrinkle on that in here because your own story on Gothamist zeroed in on one related piece, a new program called Our Home, which is for tenants to be able to buy the building that they rent in. So explain that, and how could they afford to own and operate it if people like our caller from Fresh Meadows can't?
Well, that's the question. I mean, I found that interesting because you hear from so many tenants and advocates for tenants saying, things are going so badly. We need so many repairs. We have an absentee landlord. We want a path to ownership. And this plan kind of sets a pathway to that in some limited circumstances by creating a new program in the city housing agency that would assess the conditions in a building and lay out the terms for how tenants could take ownership and what the financing that they would get for the purchase and also for the repairs that are needed. This isn't totally new. I mean, this has been happening for generations where tenants will take ownership. When it happened maybe in the 80s and 90s, though, the city could help with the acquisition, but then tenants were really on their own, tenants who became owners, for renovations and found that they couldn't keep up with those in many instances. So this type of program would try to account for that so that after people bought their building, they weren't just left in the lurch and be like, oh, wait, now we have $1 million in renovations we don't know how to cover.
All right. Mamdani's sweeping new housing proposal out yesterday, involving so many aspects of public and private housing, and we've been starting to break it down here with WNYC and Gothamist reporter on housing, David Brand. Obviously, a lot of coverage to come as they try to implement various pieces of this. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks a lot, Brian. We'll have to do that 4-year look back, see if they meet some of these goals.
There you go. Meet you in 2020. Well, that'll be 2030. But the campaign will be in 2029, so I'm sure we'll meet by then.
See you then.
All right.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.